You probably think of medieval women as helpless damsels in distress or noble ladies sipping wine in castles. But the truth is far more complex and brutal. In reality, many medieval women worked just as hard, if not harder, than men. They were not only mothers and wives, but also breadwinners, business owners, healers, and even outlaws. Forget everything you've seen in fairy tales. For most women, life wasn't about romance and royal balls, it was about survival. Whether they were grinding grain at dawn, selling goods in the marketplace, or stitching tapestries by candlelight, medieval women played a crucial role in the economy and society. But history rarely remembers them. We hear about kings and knights, but what about the woman who brewed beer to feed her children? Or the widow who ran a blacksmith shop after her husband died? These stories are hidden between the lines of dusty manuscripts, and they're worth telling. So let's pull back the curtain on one of the most overlooked parts of medieval life: how women earned their living. Some did it with grace and skill, others with grit and desperation. But all of them left behind a legacy of strength, resilience, and quiet rebellion. Let's begin with the most common and hardest working group of medieval women: the peasant women. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of roosters, crying babies, and the smell of yesterday's bread baking over a fire. You're a peasant woman in medieval Europe, and your day is about to begin. You don't have time for coffee or breakfast. The animals need feeding, the hearth needs lighting, and the fields are waiting. While men usually plowed the heavier soil, women were expected to do their share, sowing seeds, weeding crops, harvesting grain, and carrying heavy baskets on their backs or heads. And that's just the work outside. Inside the home, you're also cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, making clothes, brewing ale, and watching over the children, all while living in a one-room cottage with no glass windows, no running water, and very little privacy. Your husband may be working alongside you, or he might be gone, off fighting in a local lord's war, leaving you to manage everything alone. If you're a widow, there's no pension, no support, just survival. Children start helping as soon as they can walk. A 6-year-old might gather herbs or chase birds away from crops. Teenagers could be sent to work in noble households as servants, and if you're lucky enough to have a daughter, she'll grow up learning every skill you have, because she'll need them to survive her own life. But despite all this labor, hunger was never far away. Crops failed, livestock died, rains came too late or too early, and when famine hit, it was often women and children who suffered first. Still, you had strength. You worked harder than most nobles could imagine, and you did it barefoot, underfed, and without complaint, because complaining wouldn't bring food to the table or keep the wolves from the door. Now let's take a closer look at how some women managed to live, and even thrive, without a man at all. If you were a woman in medieval Europe, losing your husband didn't just mean heartbreak, it meant survival mode. There was no pension, no government aid, no safety net of any kind. Once your husband died, the world expected you to pick up and keep going, alone. But here's the twist. Many widows actually had more freedom than married women. While a wife needed her husband's permission for almost everything, a widow could own property, run a business, and even make legal decisions without male approval. At least in theory. Of course, reality was far more dangerous. Without a man to protect you, you became vulnerable to land grabs, forced remarriage, and accusations of witchcraft. Nobles often tried to seize a widow's inheritance, while local lords pressured her into marrying someone more suitable, usually someone who would benefit them politically or financially. Still, some women managed not only to survive but to thrive. Take Marjorie Kemp, a real medieval woman from 15th century England. After her husband fell ill, she took control of their brewing business and grain trading. She traveled across Europe on pilgrimage, wrote one of the earliest known autobiographies by a woman, and stood up to bishops and nobles when they tried to silence her. Or consider the countless unnamed peasant widows who kept farms running, raised children alone, and worked double shifts as weavers, bakers, or fishmongers. Some joined guilds if their late husbands had been members, giving them access to trade networks and protection. Others rented out land or ran small inns and taverns. In cities, skilled widows continued their husbands' crafts, blacksmithing, bookbinding, glassmaking, sometimes even training apprentices of their own. But it wasn't easy. A widow with young children had to juggle work and childcare with no daycare, no schools, and no help. If she couldn't afford to send her kids away to serve in noble households, they worked beside her, sweeping, fetching water, or selling goods in the market. And if she remained unmarried too long, rumors began to spread. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Was she a witch? Many communities saw an independent woman as suspicious, especially if she owned property or made her own money. Some widows chose to remarry quickly, not for love but for protection. Others simply disappeared from records, lost to poverty, disease, or violence. So what happened to those who never married at all? If you were a medieval woman living in the countryside, farming wasn't just a job, it was your entire life. From dawn to dusk, you worked alongside men in the fields, doing everything from sowing seeds to harvesting crops. You didn't have tractors or machines, just your hands, a wooden plow pulled by oxen, and maybe a sickle if you were lucky. You bent over rows of grain, weeded gardens under the burning sun, and carried heavy baskets of vegetables and straw on your back or head. Even pregnant women kept working until the very last day. There was no maternity leave, no rest, only survival. And when the harvest season came, everyone pitched in. Children as young as 5 ran between workers with jugs of ale or helped chase birds away from ripening crops. But farming wasn't just about food, it was about money too. If you had extra grain or eggs, you could sell them at the market for coins or barter for cloth, tools, or salt. Salt, by the way, was more valuable than gold in some places because it preserved meat and made food edible. In addition to field work, you took care of animals, feeding pigs, milking cows, collecting eggs, and sometimes even butchering livestock. It was messy, smelly, exhausting work, but someone had to do it. And let's not forget, while men often handled the heavier plowing, they also left for war, pilgrimage, or trade, leaving the farm entirely in your hands. You became the farmer, the manager, the decision-maker. Some noblewomen oversaw large estates when their husbands went off to battle. Peasant women kept the village economy alive through sheer determination and grit. So next time you think farming was a man's job in the Middle Ages, remember this. Without women, the fields would have gone untended, the animals would have starved, and the bread wouldn't have made it to the table. Now let's take a look at another tough but vital job, domestic service. If you were a medieval woman with no land, no husband, and no money, your best bet for survival was finding work. And one of the most common jobs was becoming a domestic servant. That meant leaving home at a young age, often as early as 10 or 12, to live in the household of a noble family. You didn't get weekends off, no sick leave, no privacy. Your entire life belonged to your employer. You started as a scullion, the lowest servant in the house. That meant scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, carrying water, and cleaning up after everyone else. The work was backbreaking, and the hours endless. If you worked hard and stayed out of trouble, you might be promoted to something like kitchen maid, laundress, or even lady's maid, if you were lucky enough to serve a noblewoman directly. As a lady's maid, you dressed her, helped her bathe, yes, they did bathe, but not often, and accompanied her wherever she went. It was a position of trust, and also danger. Accusations of theft, witchcraft, or even seducing the master of the house could mean instant dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. Men got to be knights and scribes. Women, we served them breakfast. And it wasn't just the physical labor that wore you down. You lived under constant scrutiny. One wrong word, one moment of defiance, and you could be thrown out with nothing, left to starve or turn to begging or prostitution. Servants slept in small rooms under the stairs, in attics, or sometimes even on the floor near the hearth. You shared beds with other servants, woke before dawn, and worked until long after sunset. Food was simple: bread, porridge, maybe some cheese or fish if it was a good day. Meat was for your masters, not for you. But despite all this, being a servant offered something rare in medieval times: stability. You had shelter, food, protection from the dangers outside the castle walls. And if you played your cards right, you might even earn a dowry over time, enough to marry and start a life of your own. Still, many women never left service. They grew old in the homes of others, raising children who weren't theirs, watching generations come and go, while their own lives remained unseen, unheard, forgotten. Now let's move into another world entirely, that of female artisans and craftswomen. When you think of medieval artisans, your mind probably jumps to male blacksmiths, stonemasons, or carpenters. But women were also skilled crafters, running workshops, making goods, and sometimes even outperforming their male counterparts. The truth is, many trades welcomed female workers, especially if they inherited a business from a husband or father. Some women became master weavers, dyers, parchment makers, and yes, even blacksmiths. Take the case of Isabella Le Taylor, a woman in 14th century London who was listed as a professional blacksmith in official records. She didn't just assist her husband, she ran her own forge. Women like her were rare, but not unheard of. Most commonly, however, women worked in textile production, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and dyeing fabrics with colors that could cost more than gold. The richer the color, the more expensive the clothing. A deep red or royal blue meant only nobles could afford it, and women were often the ones who made those dyes using crushed insects, plants, and minerals. Brewing was another surprisingly common profession for women. Before beer became big business, brewing was considered a domestic task, much like baking bread. Women brewed ale at home and sold it in markets or taverns. In fact, the word brewster comes from the feminine form of brewer, showing just how dominant women were in this trade. Some brewsters became quite wealthy. They owned large cauldrons, stored grain, and even hired help. But when brewing turned into a lucrative guild-controlled industry, men pushed women out, branding them as witches if they continued selling homemade brews. Other women worked as parchment makers, preparing animal skins to create books before the printing press. Still others made soap, candles, and leather goods, often working alongside their husbands or continuing the business after his death. But becoming a master in any trade wasn't easy. Most guilds restricted women's full participation unless they had family ties to a member. Even then, they faced suspicion, harassment, and legal barriers. Still, some women managed to rise through the ranks, training apprentices, managing workshops, and earning a living with skill and sweat. And while their names may have been forgotten by history, their work shaped the medieval world. Forget everything you've heard about medieval women being helpless or dependent. In the bustling marketplaces of Europe, women were some of the most active entrepreneurs of their time. You wouldn't find them waiting at home. No, you'd see them standing behind wooden stalls, shouting over crowds, weighing coins, haggling with customers, and running businesses that kept entire towns fed and clothed. If you were a medieval woman with a bit of skill and courage, the marketplace was your battlefield, and your chance to earn real money. You could sell food, fresh vegetables, baked bread, spiced meats, or cheese wrapped in cloth. Some women specialized in dairy products, others in eggs or honey. If you had access to fish, even better, though inland markets usually only saw dried or salted versions. Cloth and clothing were also big business. You might weave your own fabric, sew simple tunics, or sell imported silk from distant lands like Venice or Constantinople. The richer the buyer, the more exotic the material, and the higher the price. Spices were another valuable commodity. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, these came from faraway places and cost a fortune. A clever trader could make a small fortune just by reselling what she bought cheaply. And don't forget ale. Before men took over the brewing trade, many market women brewed and sold their own beer. They became known as brewsters, and they were everywhere, from village fairs to city squares. But trading wasn't easy. Women needed permission from town officials to set up shop. Sometimes they paid fees, sometimes they inherited the right from a husband or father. Without protection, they risked theft, fraud, or harassment. Still, many women found ways to thrive. Some formed networks with other female traders, sharing goods and information. Others partnered with male relatives or hired apprentices to help manage inventory and sales. In larger cities like London, Paris, or Bruges, women ran shops, rented out property, and even invested in ships and caravans. Records show that some women were listed as full merchants, not just assistants, but owners. Of course, not all tradeswomen were rich. Most worked hard for every coin, balancing family life with business demands. But they proved something powerful. Women could run businesses without asking for permission. And while history remembers kings and knights, it's the forgotten women in the market square who truly kept the medieval world turning. If you got sick in medieval times, your best hope wasn't a doctor, it was a woman. Forget the image of bearded scholars mixing potions in dusty labs. In most villages and towns, the real healers were women, mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and herbalists who knew which plants could cure a fever, stop bleeding, or ease childbirth. You didn't go to a hospital? They barely existed. You didn't call a physician? They were expensive and often clueless. Instead, you knocked on the door of the local wise woman, the one who kept bundles of dried herbs hanging from her rafters and whispered prayers over every remedy. She might have learned her craft from her mother, passed down through generations like a secret language only women spoke. She knew how to brew willow bark tea for pain, an early form of aspirin, poultice cabbage leaves on swollen wounds, and use honey as an antiseptic before anyone even knew what bacteria was. Midwives were especially vital. They delivered nearly every baby in the medieval world, with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no guarantees. A single infection could kill both mother and child. Yet these women guided families through birth after birth, using their hands, their instincts, and their knowledge of the body. But being a healer came with danger. As medicine became more formalized, male doctors began pushing women out of the field. Universities banned them from studying medicine. Laws restricted their practices. And if a woman continued treating people without permission, she risked being accused of witchcraft. Some records show that entire villages relied on female healers during plagues and famines. When the Black Death swept across Europe, killing half the population, it was often women who stayed behind to care for the sick, while men fled. They made tinctures from thyme, sage, and rosemary to fight infections. They used garlic, nature's antibiotic, to treat wounds. Some even performed basic surgeries, setting broken bones or stitching cuts, closed with thread and needle. One of the most feared accusations against a female healer was cunning woman, someone who used spells along with medicine. Healing and magic often overlapped in the medieval mind, and once suspicion took hold, it could end in tragedy. Still, despite the dangers, many women persisted. They treated burns, eased labor pains, set fractures, and brewed remedies that actually worked, long before modern science proved why. And though history may have forgotten their names, their skills saved lives when no one else could. Would you believe that some of the most free-spirited people in medieval society were women who performed on the streets? Forget everything you know about medieval women being silent and obedient. Many of them danced, sang, juggled, and even told jokes for a living. In a world where most women were expected to stay home, raise children, and obey their husbands, performers stood out. They had no choice but to live outside normal rules. These women weren't just entertainers. They were survivalists. Imagine walking through a bustling medieval market. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meat, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Suddenly, music starts playing. A woman in bright clothes spins into view, clapping her hands as she dances barefoot on the cobblestones. Another sings songs so bold they make noblemen blush. A third tosses flaming torches into the air with terrifying precision. These were jugglers, singers, dancers, and sometimes even storytellers, known as minstrels or jongleurs. Some traveled alone, others joined troops that wandered from town to town. But this life wasn't easy. They had to deal with constant suspicion. Church leaders often called them immoral. Town officials taxed them heavily, or tried to ban them altogether. And if a nobleman took an unwanted interest, well, there was little protection. Still, these women thrived. In courtly settings, they were valued for their talents. Some even performed for kings and queens. So next time you think of medieval life as quiet and orderly, remember the women who brought color, sound, and danger to every street corner. When you think of medieval religious life, you might imagine silent prayer, candlelit chapels, and holy devotion. But for many women, entering a convent was less about faith and more about survival. In a world where marriage was often forced, childbirth deadly, and divorce impossible, becoming a nun could be one of the few paths to independence. But don't be fooled. Life in a convent wasn't easy or peaceful. These women didn't just pray all day, They worked harder than most noblewomen and even some men outside the church. Their days were filled with labor, discipline, and service. Imagine waking up before dawn, shivering in a cold stone room lit only by flickering candles. You're wrapped in rough wool robes, your hands cracked from copying manuscripts with ink made from crushed berries and animal bones. This was daily life for nuns in medieval Europe. They ran schools, cared for the sick, and managed large estates. Some even acted as financiers and landowners, rare roles for women at the time. Many convents operated like small businesses. Nuns sewed their own clothes, brewed beer, baked bread, and grew food in walled gardens. Some communities became wealthy through careful management and donations from pious nobles. One of their most important jobs? Preserving knowledge. While much of Europe was illiterate, nuns spent hours each day copying books by hand, Bibles, prayers, medical texts, and sometimes even poetry. Without them, many ancient works would have been lost forever. Some abbesses ruled over vast lands and wielded more power than kings' advisors. They negotiated with rulers, oversaw hundreds of workers, and even led armies when needed. But it wasn't all power and prestige. Life in a convent came with strict rules, no personal possessions, no contact with the outside world, and constant prayer, up to 7 times a day. Still, compared to the alternative, forced marriage, endless pregnancies, or grinding poverty, many women saw the convent as the best option they had. So next time you picture a quiet nun kneeling in a chapel, remember, she might also be running a farm, managing finances, and preserving history itself. What did you do if your husband went off to war, or simply vanished on a trade route? In medieval Europe, many women found themselves in exactly that situation. And instead of waiting helplessly, they stepped up. These were the merchant wives, unsung heroines of commerce, who kept shops open, negotiated deals, and ran businesses while their husbands were away for months, sometimes even years. Imagine this. You wake up one morning to find that your husband has left for Florence to sell cloth, or worse, joined a crusade with no promise of return. What now? Do you sit at home and hope for the best? Number. You roll up your sleeves, dust off the account books, and take over. Because in the world of medieval trade, business couldn't stop just because a man was gone. Many towns had laws that allowed married women to act as legal representatives of their absent husbands. This meant they could sign contracts, collect debts, and even sue in court, something most women never got to do. Some merchant wives became so skilled that when their husbands returned, they stayed in charge, or even took over completely. They managed everything from spice imports to textile sales, often dealing with corrupt officials, dishonest traders, and foreign languages in bustling marketplaces. But it wasn't easy. A woman alone in business was seen with suspicion. She had to prove herself constantly. Some men tried to take advantage, offering unfair prices or refusing to deal with her at all. Still, these women persisted. They built networks, trained apprentices, and passed down knowledge through generations. In some cases, entire trading dynasties were run by women behind the scenes, quietly shaping the economy of medieval Europe. And if a husband died? Well, then things got even more complicated. Some women inherited the business outright, others had to fight relatives or guilds for control. But many succeeded, not only surviving, but thriving in a male-dominated world. So next time you think medieval women had no power, remember the merchant wives, the real-life CEOs of the Middle Ages, running businesses without emails, banks, or even basic rights. In a world where most trades were closed to women, there was one place where some managed to carve out a space for themselves: the guilds. Medieval guilds were like powerful unions that controlled entire industries, from weaving and baking to metalwork and bookbinding. Joining one meant security, better pay, and legal protection. But they were mostly male-only clubs. Most of the time, women weren't allowed in. But sometimes, they slipped through the cracks. How? Usually by inheriting their husband's or father's trade, and then proving they could do it just as well. Imagine this. Your husband, a skilled weaver, dies suddenly. He leaves behind his workshop, his tools, and his guild membership. You've worked beside him for years, helping with the loom, buying materials, even selling cloth at market. But when you ask to take over officially, the guild hesitates. They don't want a woman among them. Still, you stand your ground. You show them your work. You prove you can spin, dye, and weave faster and better than some of their apprentices. And slowly, they let you in. This was the path many female guild members took, not by invitation, but by necessity. Some cities allowed women to join certain trades, especially those considered women's work, like spinning, embroidery, or brewing ale. In others, women had to fight tooth and nail just to be recognized. Once inside, they faced constant suspicion. Male guild members accused them of undercutting prices or stealing business. Some tried to push them out entirely, but many survived and thrived. There are records of women who ran successful workshops, trained apprentices, and even passed down their businesses to daughters. One famous example is Alice Perrers, a 14th-century silkwoman in London. She became so influential that she ended up as a mistress to King Edward III, using her skills and connections to climb the social ladder. Another was Marjorie Brews, a medieval bride who famously negotiated her own dowry in letters that still survive today. She came from a family of merchants and understood the value of money, contracts, and negotiation. And let's not forget the brewers. Yes, brewsters, the original beer makers, were often women. Before beer became big business, it was brewed in homes, mostly by women. They controlled the recipes, the ingredients, and the sales. But as brewing became more profitable, men pushed them out. Laws changed. Women were barred from selling beer unless married or backed by a male relative. Still, some held on. So next time you think medieval women had no rights, remember these quiet rebels, the female guild members who fought to keep working, even when the system tried to shut them out. When life gave you chains, some women decided not to break, but to run. Medieval society was rigid. Women were expected to obey fathers, husbands, and lords. But what happened when obedience meant starvation, abuse, or worse? Some women chose rebellion and survival over submission. They became outlaws, not just thieves or petty criminals. These were women who defied the system, lived outside the law, and often had no other choice. Imagine this. You're a peasant woman in 14th century England. Your husband died in a war he never wanted to fight. The local lord demands more work than you can give, and your children are starving. You try to sell your crafts at market, but guilds won't let you join. You beg for mercy, but the church turns you away. You ask for help, and get beaten instead. So you do what many before you have done. You disappear into the forest. This wasn't fantasy, it was reality. Women fled to places like Sherwood Forest, joining outlaw bands or forming their own. Some disguised themselves as men to avoid detection. Others fought openly, using bows, daggers, or whatever weapons they could find. Records from medieval courts show that women were sometimes charged with crimes like theft, poaching, and even murder, but often their crimes were born of desperation. One such woman was Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, who didn't just rebel against her husband. She led an invasion to overthrow him. Talk about girl boss energy. Another was Jacqueline of Hainaut, a noblewoman who refused to marry the man chosen for her and instead took up arms to defend her lands. And then there were the everyday women, the ones who stole food to feed their families, who escaped abusive marriages by faking their deaths, who dressed as pilgrims or monks to travel safely across dangerous roads. Some joined forces with famous male outlaws. Others created networks of resistance among other women. In a world where women had almost no legal rights, breaking the rules was sometimes the only way to live on your own terms. But make no mistake, the punishment was brutal. Women caught stealing could be whipped, branded, or hanged. Those accused of witchcraft were often burned alive, especially if they challenged male authority. Even so, many kept fighting. They lied, they tricked, they ran, and they fought. Some survived long enough to carve out new lives under fake names. Others weren't so lucky, but every time one of them broke free, they sent a message. Not all women would be controlled. So next time you think of the Middle Ages as a time of silence and obedience, remember the rebels. The women who risked everything to escape a life of servitude. The outlaws who lived by their own rules, even if those rules were written in blood. So what does all this tell us about the women of medieval times? That they were not just passive figures in history. They were fighters, workers, leaders, and survivors. From the bustling markets to the quiet convents, from outlaw bands to guild halls, medieval women found ways to live on their own terms, even in a world that tried to silence them at every turn. They weren't waiting for a prince or a priest to save them. They saved themselves. Some did it through skill, mastering trades, running businesses, and passing down knowledge through generations. Others did it through faith, leading religious communities, preserving books, and educating others when formal schooling was rare. A few did it through rebellion, fleeing abusive marriages, disguising themselves as men, or joining outlaws in the forest just to escape a life of servitude. And many simply endured, raising children without medicine, working dangerous jobs with no protection, and surviving diseases we now cure with a simple pill. What's clear is that these women were not helpless. They were resilient. They had to be, because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't guaranteed, especially if you were born female. But despite everything stacked against them, lack of rights, poor health care, limited education, and constant danger, they carved out spaces for themselves. Some left behind records of their lives in letters, contracts, and court documents. Others vanished into history, remembered only by their families or the people they helped. And some became legends. Like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who ruled over one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe and lived well into her 80s. Or Christine de Pizan, who became one of the first female professional writers in history, defending women's intelligence and strength in a time when most believed women should remain silent. Or Matilda of Tuscany, who led armies and defended the Pope during political wars, ruling over vast lands in Italy. These women didn't just survive, they thrived. So next time you think of the Middle Ages as a time of knights and castles, remember the real heroes of the era, the women who worked, fought, prayed, and dreamed, even when the world told them they couldn't. They weren't just part of history. They were history.